Sir, some technical issues. Sir, he'll be back, sir, in few minutes. So, good morning, all the participants. Please wait for another 2 minutes. I think resource person is facing a bit technical issue. Once he is back, then we'll start.
Hello.
Hello, sir. Yeah, good morning. Sir. Yes. Sir. Yes.
Good morning, sir.
Morning, morning.
Yeah, yes, sir. Good morning.
Yes.
Sorry, those
No, so no issue, sir. Shall we, sir?
Yes, sir. We'll start. I'll
Yes.
just share
Yes.
it.
Yeah. Prabhu?
So yes, sir, we can start.
Yeah. So good morning to all. Thank you so much for your presence. Thank God for yet another day of learning. The Department of Sociology, Bardhan University, because last webinar I gave an overview about the Department of Sociology, Bardhan University. So today also I would like to share about the department. The Department of Sociology, Bardhan University, started in the year 1979 as Extension Center under University of Madras. In the year 1983, the Bardhan University started. Since then, the department successfully running, offering a postgraduate program, MPhil and PhD program in sociology.
Hello.
The alumni of the department are very well positioned and as eminent professors, administrators, and policymakers. Myself and Dr. Suresh Babu sir, so proud to be part of the department. We are always intended to work towards development of the department and the discipline, sociology discipline. In that line, we have planned a webinar series to disseminate in-depth discussion of sociological theory and research methods. We had webinar series 1 last week where the eminent faculty shared their views on theoretical perspectives and current trends in insights into contemporary sociological theories. In continuation, we have started webinar series 2 on recent developments in social science research. Yesterday, we had Dr. Guram Srinivas, Center for Social Systems, Jawaharlal Nehru University, gave a session on mixed methods research. Many of the participants gave a good opinion about his presentation. They said that his presentation was so useful. Hope the seminar actually useful to many of you. Today we have another eminent and well-learned faculty, Dr. Kumaran, with us. He is assistant professor and director in charge, Center for Studies in Sociology, Department of Gandhian Thought and Peace Science, Gandhigram, Rural Institute, deemed to be University, Gandhigram, Dindukal, Tamil Nadu. I think more than the academic affiliation, I think we both are very good friends. And he's so approachable and well knowledgeable in the area of particularly the qualitative research. I think I felt that he is the right person to talk about the theoretical applications in research. So, sir, on behalf of Department of Sociology and Population Studies, Bardhan University, and on behalf of all the participants, we wholeheartedly welcome you, sir, and thanks for your presence. We are really happy and honored to have you today, sir. So please, we welcome you, sir. Now I'll hand over mic to Dr. Suresh Babu sir to introduce the resource person and as well as the topic. Thank you so much, sir. Welcome you.
Hello. Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and all the participants from various parts of India, and my colleagues from various colleges and universities, and students from various universities and colleges. It's my immense pleasure to introduce my friend, Dr. R. Kumaranji. He's my immediate senior in Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. Did his MA in JNU and CSSS, that is the Sociology Department. With small note, I just wanted to read out his profile. Dr. R. Kumaran, a director in charge of Department of Gandhian Thought and Center for Studies in Sociology, Gandhigram Rural University, deemed to be a central university. That is important. Recently, I came to know that that's going to be a central university. Okay. Dr. Kumaran has combined 17 years of teaching and research experience, having taught at postgraduate level during most of his career. He has acquired his undergraduate degree in uniquely designed interdisciplinary program, religion, philosophy, and sociology at the prestigious the American College of Madurai. His PG degree in sociology from Department of Sociology, Center for Study of Social System, JNU, New Delhi. While his MPhil in sociology is from Delhi School of Economics, Delhi University. Followed by his PhD was on Gandhian approach to development and poverty obtained from Gandhigram Rural University. He is currently a faculty member in the Center for Studies in Sociology at the Department of Gandhian Thought and Peace Science, Gandhigram Rural Institute, deemed to be a central university. Before joining Gandhigram Rural University, Dr. Kumaranji had a 5 years of stint as research director at ActionAid India, wherein he strove to install Gandhian values into the development of research and action. His research interests are centered around 1. Formulating Gandhian research methodology for social sciences. 2. For positioning native sociology tempered with the indigenous social philosopher and thinkers such as M.K. Gandhi and Ambedkar. And 3. Popularizing public sociology that brings the lost human to front stage in true Gandhian spirit. He has traveled widely across the world, participating in international conferences and symposia, lobbying for these ideas and to learn from such initiative from the other countries. His publication too reflect his thrust areas of research, with 3 of his 5 books are on bringing marginalized people's experiences to the central stage of social science epistemology. His 30+ research articles and project focus have been largely around these themes. Today he is going to deliver a very important topic that is a very much qualitative research. And we know that in sociology, the people we used to follow quantitative is very important. At the same time, the recent sociological research like Alfred Schutz or Adnan Israel and most of the critical theorists, hermeneutics, like postmodernism, post-structure, these are the theorists are questioning the positivism in such an extent that we are studying about human behavior and social action. So today's topic is very relevant to address this issue in sociology in particular and other social sciences in general. The topic is going to deliver is the use and deployment of theory in social science research. Sir, on behalf of Department of Sociology and Population Studies, Bharathiar University, Coimbatore, we wholeheartedly invite you to address this gathering, to enlighten them or enlighten us with this excellent lecture for us. Thank you so much, sir. Please welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you, for having given me such a glowing introduction. I hope I'm audible. I can just somebody confirm whether they're hearing me?
Yes, sir. You are audible, sir. You can continue.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. At the outset, I would like to really register my warm thanks and good morning wishes to all the organizers of this program, particularly Professor Sampath Kumarji, the director, the head of the Department of Sociology and Population Studies, aided by one of his very supportive and learned colleagues, Dr. Suresh Babuji, who's been instrumental in probably bringing some of these speakers like us into this, even though we are all wonderful friends. I would like to also thank and welcome and offer my good mornings to Prabhu, who has been supporting the team by providing technical inputs and assistance. And definitely all the participants from across the country. It's like a huge number, already 83, and I hope it will only keep adding. It's a really tragicomic experience when in this kind of COVID-19 times, when we are able to reach a lot of people, but still not being able to see one another, flesh and blood. It's always a mixed experience, but it's wonderful to see all of you. I would like to also thank the authorities of Bharatiya University for making it possible by encouraging the departments to organize webinars during these kinds of off classroom days for the students. So the radiating influence of Bharatiya University, which has been very ranked very highly in the NIRF, is really touching lives and the minds and hearts of a whole lot of students I know, and scholars as well. So it's a very heartwarming experience for me to be part of this webinar. As Sampathji introduced, I was quite excited and heartened to see kind of a theme on this webinar, on this kind of a theme where he's trying to really encourage researchers and students of MA programs also to learn new models, new theories, and training them in research. It's really amazing and wonderful. Thank you so much for doing it, sir. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I also have wonderful colleagues and co-presenters starting from yesterday. I would like to also thank and welcome them also to this seminar. With that, I would like to just move on to making my presentation. I'll just put it on. Just to save the bandwidth, I will put off my video. I will only just go with my presentation. In fact, when Sampathji suggested this topic to me, I immediately jumped onto this topic for a lot of reasons. Putting theory first, which is, I gave a lot of choices, and Sampath Ji chose this particular topic, and I'm very glad. One of the reasons why I jumped on this topic is basically, this is the issue or concern that we quite often encounter, both as research supervisors, as well as if I go back in time as research scholars in my own lives. In our own lives, we all face difficulties in terms of how one can bring theories into research. And as a research supervisor who's been part of the different research committees, we also encounter students who have a similar concern with them. When we attend Viva or say programs, we often realize how theory has always taken a backseat and put on the back burner of many of these research projects and research theses. And when we talk to the students, they also express their difficulties in terms of how we are going to integrate theories into our research. This I'm saying with due respect to brilliant research scholars who are absolutely brilliant enough to already know how to integrate theories, and they are well versed in theories, and they're well versed in integrating theories into their research. So I'm only targeting those who chose to join this program, assuming that this will help them probably solve a perennial problem of integrating research theories into the research agendas and research process. Okay, with that, I've just slightly modified the title from use to the significance, probably to just get out of the instrumental, I kind of a use kind of an attitude to a significance kind of an attitude. So I just decided to make it significance rather than use. And this is going to be my outline briefly. This presentation is a bit detailed and elaborate, and I will jump wherever it gets a little too detailed, and I'll only focus on those things that will probably help all of us in this particular endeavor. Okay, this is my outline, and I'll just start with making some kind of an observations, almost a kind of a setting the tone for our presentations today. Very often we forget the fact, for a lot of reasons, that which I'll also be elaborating, that theoretical framework is very, very important. In fact, I've just deliberately chosen the word theoretical framework rather than theory, even though the title of the presentation is about theory. Actually speaking, this presentation is not about theory, because about theory we've been already taught a lot in our master's programs, as well as MPhil and PhD coursework programs. So what is very important is not so much to learn about theories, which we are already learning in exciting or a non-exciting way, whatever it may be. But what is very important is the very spirit of this presentation is not so much about talking about theories as such, but to integrate theoretical framework into the research processes. So theoretical research framework is a very, very important aspect of a research process, and a very important component, but very unfortunately largely not covered during our doctoral coursework. It is theory we cover, but not so much in terms of how to evolve a theoretical framework, how to understand the theoretical framework, and how to integrate that, make it central to our research process. So I'm trying to touch on a lacunae which most of our doctoral programs have. Probably we always reserve it for a webinar or a seminar or a workshop on how to integrate theoretical frameworks. But the time has come for us to really integrate that into our coursework as such. So when we talk about theories or theoretical framework, it is a very frustrating experience for a lot of scholars. Many of them express a lot of confusion, many of them express lack of knowledge, and it is always frustrating for them to choose a particular theoretical framework and how to apply that in their thesis and presentation also. So this frustrating experience is what we are trying to address here. The reason why it's become very frustrating is also because of the legacy that we have. Very often theories, the sociological theories or any theory, is always a very drab and dragging kind of an experience for most of us. People shudder to think of a theory class. People are scared of theory classes. Theory teaching teachers are terrors. Theory teachers are bore. That's how we've been almost socialized into our knowledge making, knowledge acquiring process, where we always think it's terrible to learn theories, and theories are always boring. Perhaps whenever somebody teaches them, also they teach it in such a vague and formulaic and esoteric terms. It's very difficult to comprehend theories and really internalize it as something that is going to have a tremendous amount of significance for me. And our graduate programs, whether it is PG programs or even MPhil research programs, they do not really emphasize the significance of theories, and rather they always make a concession, okay, theory is something that, okay, I know it's very difficult, you can always do it later type. So, and even more interestingly, or unfortunately, even our academic publication, except a few peer-reviewed, stringently reviewed publications, most of the publications are willing to accept articles and publications, even books for that matter, without any theoretical underpinnings in them. Perhaps had these publications been a little more rigid and strict and enforcing the basic tenets and canons of publication, asking the research, the publishers, the writers to integrate theories into their research publications, perhaps we would have already been trained in that. I know it is quite possible for many of us to publish an article which would not have a strong theoretical underpinning into it. So even our publication, both the upstream and downstream connections are very weak when it comes to integrating theories into our research. So the legacies can be really terrible. And we often, in our student or scholar community, we have a situation where many of them treat theories as a kind of an appendage, or many of them do it as a kind of an afterthought. After finishing their dissertation, they think now they can work on dissertation. It's very comical. Some of the students also come to me after almost getting their dissertations print ready, and they come to me and ask me, sir, can I have some theory books? I just, director told me, or the supervisor told me to integrate some theories. And they integrate the theories within a couple of days, even sometimes a couple of hours they integrate it. So it is always omitted, it is always an excluded category. And but theories are not exactly something that is to be kept outside, kept at the fag end of our research process, or something that is definitely external to a researcher. In fact, I always see a very strong biographical connection between a theory and a research, and the theorist and the researcher. In fact, if you really recall, all the great sociologists, classical sociologists like Warke Merton or Peter L. Berger, they're all students of Alfred Schultz, Parsons, respectively. And it is because they were so inspiring that they took it as a kind of a life view, as a kind of a life philosophy. And their commitment to the theory is not exactly a commitment to an academic ritual, but a commitment to a life itself. So when a person chooses a theory, when a researcher chooses a theory, it is not an arbitrary, ritualistic, instrumental choice a person makes. It has to be something that reflects the core life principles of a person also, the political standpoint of a person also. The person's personal beliefs should also be in congruence, in connection with the theory. And in fact, the theory is also so much about the way we understand knowledge. And we need to understand theories as an integrally connected, organically related to the researcher himself or herself, that it cannot be left to the mercy of some typist, or sometimes we just leave it to the mercy of someone else to integrate it. So we need to really use the theories as an important tool, as an important experience into our research processes. So one has to, in fact, I'll be elaborating more on how we need to find that biographical connection, because theories are something that reflects one's personal core beliefs. So it is, in a very metaphorical and literal sense, the entire edifice, the entire structure of our research, thesis or project, whatever it may be, is built on the foundation of the theoretical framework. The theoretical framework influences the very fabric of our research at every level, and we need to recognize that it is not something to be added as an afterthought. It has to be something that has to be starting at a very beginning itself. And this is not just about our scholarship. It is not just about doing research as a PhD scholar. It is also integrating theory, theoretical framework is also very integrally connected to the entire research perceptions, research activities that the person will be doing throughout his or her own life. And it is also connected to the very idea of being a professor of a knowledge, someone who professes knowledge. That's what we call it by professorate. So someone who is committed himself to the pursuit of knowledge cannot be doing it in the vacuum of a theory or a theoretical framework or a theoretical standpoint. And that's why it is all pervasive. It connects to a whole lot of things in our research practices and processes. And here I would like to just warn in a very kind and gentle way that it is impossible to think of a research which is not theoretical in nature. If someone thinks there can be a research without being theoretical, probably that is probably the most unsound research it can be. That probably maybe the research that that lacks the character, that lacks the personality. So if a research has to have a character and or a personality, that research should be theoretical in nature. So it is impossible to imagine a research which is not theoretical in nature. That's why I said, like, lack of theory in a research expresses, reflects lack of character of a research, but as well as that of a researcher himself or herself. It is not just the lack of character of the research, but also the researcher himself will be understood as someone who doesn't have a character, who doesn't have a kind of a competency as a researcher. So this theoretical framework, and this presentation is about theoretical framework and how are we going to understand it and evolve it and differentiate it from other frameworks, and how do we integrate it. So this is very, very important because it becomes the blueprint of our entire research inquiry. And the choice of the word blueprint is, again, is not accidental, but very consciously chosen, because when you want to build a structure, a building, you normally start with a blueprint, and your building is influenced by the blueprint at every level, whether it is economizing, spatializing, at every level, the blueprint is what influences the structure, even though there can be creative deviations here and there. Similarly, the theoretical framework provides the foundation or blueprint for our research. And this theoretical framework calls for what we would like to call it as the pre-theoretical commitment. In fact, from the researchers, we need a kind of a pre-theoretical commitment, not a post-research commitment, which is what most of the time we do. It is a post-factum justification. It is something that happens, okay, we always reserve it for the last day. But we need to have a kind of a pre-theoretical commitment from the researcher, which means it has to be something that is the first step in formulating a research project or research thesis or research idea. So this theoretical commitment, what we would like to call it as the pre-theoretical commitment, cannot be something that is driven by the logicality and the core reasons of our mind, but it should be something that should be driven by heart rather than mind. In fact, when some of the really seriously minded researchers, when we talk to them, why are they not doing a project, or why are they not really doing something which is focusing on a research, they will say, I'm not doing a research because my heart is not haunted by a question. For me, a research is basically an attempt to find a credible answer, a potential answer for the haunting questions of my heart. So research is not all the time driven by mind, not by certain calculations of promotion, of calculations of acquiring instrumental degree and kind of labels like doctorate and all that, but it should be something that is driven largely by heart. I'm not saying it should not be there, but the first process is one that you are actually haunted by an important question. A question haunts you and you would like to find an answer for that. So theory is a deep expression of that heart-driven hauntedness of a researcher. Because the research cycle that we are talking about, the pre-theoretical aspect comes here when we talk about the research cycle here. The research cycle, we all know that involves 3 different levels, but theoretical commitment should start prior to this research process. So though they are interconnected, we often start our theories, our research projects or research attempts with research design or a design cycle. That's where the whole research process starts, the design cycle, where we ask questions, we think of conceptual framework, do literary review. Then we move into the data collection process, that's called ethnographic cycle. Then we do the analytical cycle. These are the 3 important cycles or processes within a research cycle. And theoretical framework formulation starts prior to that, which is going to get integrated into the design process, as well as it is going to influence the ethnographic process and analytical process. It's going to, as I told, it's going to influence every fabric, every minute practices of our research process throughout. But it has to be something that has to start before the research cycle itself. This I keep reiterating primarily because many of us postpone it to the last. And the reason why theoretical commitment or pre-theoretical commitment is solicited from the research scholars or research supervisors or anybody who does a research at any level, whether they are professors or postgraduate scholars or PhD scholars, we call for the commitment because research theoretical framework involves, in a very paradigmatic sense, 3 important components in it. So what is the theoretical framework? A theoretical framework essentially contains 3 important components. And these 3 important components are the ontology, epistemology, and methodology. And it is these core principles, those core aspects that provide the foundational structure for a theory that also connects the theory to the theorist, to the researcher. So the researcher and the research link and the holy connection happens when we locate our research framework on these 3 things and we focus and pay sufficient attention to these 3 important aspects of this research. In fact, it is at the intersection of these 3 a theoretical framework emerges: the ontology, epistemology, and methodology. I'm so sorry, I'm using a lot of jargons, but I'll explain it. But this is very important because that's exactly the reason why we also are averse to theories. The reason why we are very averse and suffer from a kind of a theory fatigue is because we are often averse to concepts or jargons. We call them simply jargons, but they are not jargons. They are concepts that are tellingly important in research. So it is this intersection of these 3, ontology, epistemology, and methodology. We have the research theoretical framework sitting and emerging. So what is this ontology? Ontology is a big term, but very simple. Ontology is basically, it's about what we think about human beings in the very first place. We are all social science researchers. And our primary unit of analysis or primary unit of study often is the human beings and their experiences and their own consciousness and their own social relationships. So fundamentally, the last reducible unit of our research is always a human being. But it's very important to have an idea of who this human being, what is my idea of this human being. So the second important thing is, I'll just a little more elaborate it just in the next slide. And the second important thing is the epistemology. What is my idea of knowledge? What is my idea of a social knowledge? And the third important thing is the methodology. What kind of a methodological choices I'm going to make? This is those three are very philosophical, but let me just break it down for sociology. Sociologically speaking, what is ontology? Ontology is actually my own sense of humans. The social actor, as we call in our social science researches. You may very well know that in sociology, there is an unresolving perennial fight between two schools, two ways of looking at human beings. One group of people think of human beings as very creative, imaginative, agency-driven people who make choices on their own. And there is another group of people who say, no, people are just automaton, they are born into religions, born into language groups, born into caste, and they cannot do anything about it. They are all nothing but victims of structure. This is the perennial debate within sociology. And our theories are largely divisible along these hierarchies. Either you will be able to identify a theory as a theory that is focusing on the agency of an individual or the structure of the society. Durkheim will be a structural kind of a person, whereas Max Weber would be more focusing on the understanding and individual agency, how an individual makes sense of things, the Westerham. Similarly, phenomenology will be agency, Marxism will be structure. So if you really want to slot every theory, all these theories will be having a fundamental and foundational notion of whom they think a human being is. So we need to, as theorists, as sociologists, we cannot escape from having a foundational understanding that a theory must be focusing on. Either I have to make a choice, whether I'm going to be on the side of agency or I'm going to be on the side of structure. Even though there is a middle ground proposed by Anthony Giddens, you would have heard in the other lecture. So, but primarily even that is debatable, but we need to make a choice. Am I going to think of myself as a very agency, as a creative person, or as a victim, as a person who's constantly shaped only by the structure and I do not have any individual imaginativeness? So similarly, our understanding of a human being, again, in a very, because of the very birthplace of sociology being Europe and America, their understanding of a human being is that human beings are extremely individualistic, constantly governed by rational principles of decision making. They are very rational people. They always think and make calculation. Whereas probably Eastern visions are looking at human beings differently. They are looking at human beings as collective individuals. They will not be able to think independent of the structures they belong to. So we need to make a choice between these two also. Am I going to look at each individual as individuals, or I'm going to look at individuals as part of a structure, as reflective of the structural processes they are part of? This is very important, finally, to make even our choices for tools of data collection. If you are very individualistic in nature, you may not hesitate to use an interview schedule because you think an individual who answers the question in an interview to your questions is answering as an individual. He is not actually representing a structure. That's why you need to talk to the parents again if you want a different answer from him. Whereas if you really believe that an individual is part of the structure, if you're doing a study of a film or a novel, then you would not really think what that novelist or a filmmaker thinks. What is very important is how the filmmaker as a representative of the structure has made a film. If you're going to do a study of Shankar's film, it is not we are bothered about what Shankar thinks individually. We are more interested in how Shankar, as part of the Tamil or globalized Indian society, how he speaks a language that is social in nature. So then we will not be talking to Shankar, we will be studying his films. If we're really going to believe in individuals, we are going to be talking to Shankara, but not studying the films as much. So these are all very important choices we need to make. Similarly, our sense of the reality itself. The first one is our sense of the human who are part of that structure. The second is the very structure of the social reality itself. Do we really believe that our reality, that what we see outside is something that is objective or something subjective? In other words, like, does a classroom become a classroom? For an example, I'm just illustrating. Does a classroom become a classroom because students in the classroom and the teachers regard it as a classroom? Or is it because it has got blackboards, chairs, and desks Does the structure make a classroom? Our classroom, does it exist independent of what meaning I attribute to it? Or is it primarily a product of those individuals attributing a meaning to it? That's why it is possible for a classroom to emerge even under a tree, shadow of a tree, when teachers and students regard it as a classroom. So who makes the classroom? The structure, the objective reality, or the individuals? So we all ultimately, we make realities possible. That's one group of people, micro level. All those people who believe in the agency of an individual would believe that it is we. Our families are not families because of the law of the land, or even not because of the house, which has got a kitchen or a drawing room and bedroom. It is because each one of us think it's a family. The moment we start treating it as a hostel and pay for our food, it's going to become a hostel. So that differentiation also is very important. That's also an ontological question. And we need to be very clear from day one as a sociologist, which side we belong to, or which side we give predominant importance to. I'm not saying one has to be either or, but which is primarily our political, our emotional and existential position. Similarly, connected to that is the sense of reality being transcendental, something that is living beyond all of us, unchanging and perennially structuring. And there is other group of people who say, no, your realities are constantly renewed and structured by the people who come in and move out. So it is these individuals who co-create that reality. That's where it is also connected to the next structure. So what is epistemology? Again, sociologically meaning, what is epistemology here? So epistemology is basically what constitutes knowledge. Particularly in our case, so sociology is what constitutes our social knowledge. In fact, we all know that knowledge can be broken down into certain units. For example, for some people, a string of facts make knowledge. Knowledge is nothing but a combination of facts, unchanging for the seeing individuals. Whether 10 people see or not, if the classroom has 4 fans, for all the students in the classroom, there are only 4 fans. It's a fact. But the meaning of having a fan may be different for each one of the students in the classroom. For someone, the fans might have come very late in his life, or someone, there may not be a fan at home, so the fan is a big deal. So what constitutes our social knowledge? That is an epistemological choice we have to make. If I'm going to be a kind of a person who believes that just like a scientist, social facts, like Durkheim says, is a fact which do not have any individual significance, it is always collective, beyond, independent and external, or is it something that is so significant for me? Are we driven in our individual lives as social actors or as researchers by the knowledge that everything is meaningful or everything is factual? And that connects us to the kind of researcher that I want to be. Epistemologically, what kind of a researcher I imagine myself to be? Am I a kind of a scientifically minded researcher? Am I constantly imagining myself as a scientist in nature, objective all the time? And if I'm not scientific, I'm not adequately researcher enough. Or am I imagining myself as an artist? Even though we claim sociology to be a science, it's paradoxically still classified as masters of arts. But that debate is also going on. Some people call it art, some people call it science. And we need to make a choice whether I'm going to be scientifically minded or artistically minded. If you're artistically minded, you will be thinking of all the experiences as meanings, and you will adequately study them and accordingly study them. And in the kind of relationship that you have with the social reality, the knowledge and the knowledge providers, when you go for data collection, what is your relationship with the research relationship that you have with yourself and the research field or the people in it? Are we going to do data collection as an extractive process? Do we assume in a very scientific way that all the people in the field have no other business but to give me data, just like a scientist would imagine that all the guinea pigs, all the rats do not have any other business than being subject to the study of, subject to the experiment of a scientist? Or am I thinking of the people in the field as like me, democratic, as people who are as meaningful to their own selves as they are to me, or as I'm to myself? So what is my relations with the people in the field? Do I treat them as one step below me, as some poor basic people who do not really know anything about what's happening to them and only I have to go and show the light? Or am I imagining them as people who are part of my research process? That also will decide The methodologies that we choose, the tools that we choose, all those things will also be determined by. So the theoretical framework involves this, and that defines the next other processes, whether my research tools, how are they going to be developed, and all those things we develop will be based on that. Similarly, what is the purpose of my research? That is also an epistemological question. Why do I want to do a research? Am I doing this research because of the haunting question that I would like to answer? I would like to do this research because I would like to liberate myself and liberate others. And someone would ask the question, then what will the research become objective or not? That's a question that we'll address later. So I need to think of my research as something that is going to benefit me instrumentally. Yes, it's a research that will give me promotion. It will give me a PhD. That will give me a certain labels. If I do a project, then I'll be respected widely among my teaching community. So am I approaching the research as an instrumental, self-serving kind of an experience or a project, or am I seeing it as primarily liberating myself individually and also helping a lot of people to liberate themselves? So we call it as action research and all that, but more than that, very beginning of our research itself, we need to think of it as an exercise that emancipates, that at least if not emancipatory, at least critical in nature, instead of simply becoming pro-establishment, pro-institutional, going with the grain. It is very important to think of our research as also possibly going against the grain. So the third final dimension, which is also very important, is the methodological dimension. What kind of a method I'm going to use? Here again, we have to make a very clear-cut choice in terms of whether my study is going to be an inductive or a deductive kind of a study. The specific nature of a social reality makes us ask this question: can we really repeat what positivism suggests us to do? Repeat the natural science methods of induction, or am I going to do a deductive kind of a research as philosophers and logicians do it? So what is the methodological choice that I'm going to make? Is my research inductive or deductive? So very often social science being concerned with people who are also reflecting and thinking and talking back, it is impossible to really take 10 people's experience and then interpolate it and generalize it for a whole lot of people, which is considered to be a kind of an academic epistemological violence by some people. You cannot really make 10 people's thinking into 1,000 people's thinking, even though one can only talk about trends. Whereas in deductive, we actually try to understand people in their own right and try to deduce from few people experiences and do not want to generalize. So we move from particular to general. Yeah. Then the next important thing is the explanatory and interpretative choices that we have to make. Very often, if you are a very scientifically minded person, you always believe that explanation is the spirit of my research. Explanation here would mean a very scientific, singular kind of an explanation, because there cannot be many explanations, because explanation by its very nature is exclusionary. It only includes one possibility of an explanation. Whereas interpretation is multiple in nature. And if you really make a choice whether my research is going to be an interpretive research where I'm going to believe as a researcher, I'm going to interpret what people are already interpreting, or am I going to think of myself as someone who's going to be interpretative in nature? That actually leads us to the third choice, whether my research is going to be quantitative or qualitative. Even though I'm not anti-quantitative, I'm not against numbers. Being a social science research, we need to ask our questions. What is my primary purpose? If my primary purpose is to simply show general trends, the larger processes and tendencies, as quantitative research might help if you want to really analyze thousands of people's data. But if you're really focusing on few number of people, even if it is 500 or 250, or even less than that, can we think we are dealing with few people? Can we really generalize these 250 or 500 people's experiences into a vast mass? So can we think of a different kind of an approach? A qualitative approach is also a choice that we need to make. That is also part of the theoretical framework. And that probably finally boils down to whether my research is going to be a top-heavy, top-down kind of a research where everything is decided at the air-conditioned rooms or academic portals, then only the finished cooked product is being taken to the people. Or am I developing the research design at every level Am I making everybody part of the research process, even the people whom I'm studying? So am I looking at things from bottoms up perspective, or am I looking at things from the top down perspective? If someone is a very structurally minded person, he'll be looking at it from top down, or she'll be looking at it from the top down. Whereas a micro level kind of a study would ask us to look at it mostly in terms of the bottoms of perspective. So that this is exactly what constitutes the theoretical framework. This theoretical framework gives paves way for constituting a conceptual framework. And this conceptual framework is derivative of the theoretical model that we have chosen. For example, as on the basis of the theoretical framework we have discussed, if you've chosen a critically micro level interpretive theory, you have kind of a phenomenological theory, or if you are choosing the other one, a very structuralistic kind of a Marxist or a Durkheimian or Auguste Comte's analysis of social law of 3C. So if you've chosen a particular theoretical model, that also provides you a conceptual framework. And I often noticed in our research practices and meetings, our research scholars, and even sometimes even many of us, including us, also, teachers also, we often see a kind of a disjuncture, a kind of a disconnect between the conceptual framework and the title, or the conceptual framework and the theoretical choices, if at all one makes the theoretical choice. The conceptual apparatus must be very clearly linked to the theoretical framework that you have chosen. For example, it will be very contradictory for someone to choose a conceptual framework that are derivative of a functionalist theory and apply it in a phenomenological kind of a theoretical model. So these two will be not matching one another. They are contradictory in nature, because a functionalism which looks at things from structural point of view, which doesn't believe in micro level approach, will not really make sense if you really choose a phenomenologically driven concept like life world or interpretation or horizon of meaning. So we need to choose particularly specific concepts. For example, if someone chooses a concept of empowerment, then we need to really connect it to the theory that we have chosen. Am I really looking at the empowerment in terms of a very Marxian kind of a framework, which believes in collective rights, empowerment of people through law, or am I thinking in terms of a micro level study which treats empowerment as a micro victory, a small weapons of the weak kind of a perspective, where empowerment means not having a big law, that is also very important, but also the freedom to do the micro things, the micro freedoms to do smaller things are also part of empowerment. It is one thing to have a law against dowry, and that alone doesn't empower a woman, but also women should on a day-to-day basis feel the empowerment of even being able to have a remote in her hand to change channels. We often know patriarchy operates at a micro level in terms of immediately robbing the remote control from the woman's hand the moment the husband enters. I mean, in a general sense of the term. So how do we see that? The channel choices, that is the micro level process. So these conceptual frameworks should really match the theoretical framework that you have chosen. So this the theoretical framework is derived from theories. Conceptual framework is derived from concepts. So, but they are linked to one another very integrally and organically. So the theoretical framework and conceptual framework are not one and the same. They are not exchangeable. They are different, but they are connected. So this conceptual framework, which is another domain through which the theoretical theories can be integrated into the research, offers a kind of logical structure of connected concepts. When I say logical, I'm not talking about rational, modern kind of a logic, but I'm talking about the connection between the concepts. They cannot be non-connected or underconnected, or they should be connected to one another in a very explanatory, interpretative sense. They must be connected. So these also must be, as I told again, must be related to the theoretical framework. We cannot think of a conceptual framework that doesn't relate to the theoretical framework. So the concepts which we know, the difference between a concept and a word is that the concept has an agreed meaning within the academic community. If they are sociologists, they have an agreed meaning. When they say society, when they say joint family, it means one thing. It means the same for all the sociologists, whereas for a person from outside sociology, it may mean something else. That's why it's called concepts. But these concepts are theoretically tempered. That's why there are as many concepts for the same phenomenon as there are theories. So we need to know the difference between one concept and its link with the theory, and another concept, the same concept and links with the other theory. Just I told, the concept of empowerment in a Gandhian framework will be different from the concept of empowerment from Marxian framework. Both may use the same concept, but may understand it in a very nuanced manner. So these concepts are not simply string of, when I say logically connected, it's not exactly string of concepts. They're just chained together without having any organization or an underlying principle, but they are kind of epistemologically and ontologically connected to our own lives, our own choices that we make as a researcher. So very often we ask the question whether our research can be purely objective, or isn't it very important that we have our research happening in an objective manner. But actually speaking, it is not necessary that objectivity is the opposite of subjectivity. Particularly within the social science tradition, it has now been agreed that the opposite of objectivity is not exactly subjectivity, but reflexivity. So if you reflexively organize your research by thinking in terms of your own biases, thinking in terms of your own kind of baggage of experiences that you bring into the research, then it is not exactly subjective. So subjective is not the same as reflexivity. And we need to be reflexive. And even a scientist is reflexive in terms of the choices he or she makes to do an experiment on. So the conceptual apparatus that we choose should also be connected in a reflexive way to my epistemological choices and the ontological worldview that I've already chosen. I've already elaborated on that. So I need to really be very clear whether I'm going with the agency idea. I think of people as structure, whether I think people are creators or the structure creates people. So this differentiation, once we know, our concepts also will reflect it. That is very, very important. I'll illustrate it later. So it is an integrated way of looking at a problem, and it is also a course of action is also given to us in terms of the kind of concepts we choose. We also announce our affinity to a particular theoretical model. We also announce our affinity to a particular set of actions that we'll be doing as part of our research. So it is very connected, and finally these concepts can provide guidelines to the variables that we'll be choosing. Because I would like to imagine a social research as something like a social relationship. In fact, Norman and Denzin, who's been writing very extensively on qualitative sociology and qualitative research, which is gaining currency even among other people, who calls a social research as primarily a social relationship. We cannot have an extractive relationship, instrumental relationship, either with the research or with the people from whom we collect our data. So it has to be connected to our own personal ethics, and reflexively it must organize. So it's a small example of a conceptual framework that one of my research scholars used in her research, PhD research. She was doing a research on how women are getting empowered in terms of acquiring social capital. She was not interested in how law empowers them, but on a day-to-day basis, how she's empowering herself in terms of the different capitals, social, political, cultural, and economic capital. So she understood empowerment in terms of the social capital idea. The concepts that she derived were all from the social capital model of Putnam and all that. So from that, she elaborated she understood the derivative of social capital in terms of having a strong connection to the land. Since she was doing research on land rights, she was trying to see how, when a woman accesses the material capital called land, she also is able to acquire other social capital. So the entire conceptual apparatus were supplied by the social capital theory. The social capital theoretical framework provided her the conceptual framework. She couldn't have chosen a concept that comes not only from outside the social capital framework, but also contradicts it. So she was very careful, and we also conducted our research process in such a way that it cannot be what we call a bastardization of research, a research that has got too many fathers coming from completely contradictory kind of situations or orientations. So we wanted to ensure that the conceptual connectivity and ethically as well as theoretically, there is a seamless connectivity between the person's understanding of women. Her understanding of women is such that herself being a woman, she always thought women are very creative people. Women are very constantly hardworking and striving people. Her sense of ontology of human was very clear. And her theoretical choice was informed by that ontological choice that she had. So she chose social capital theory because she believes women are constantly working very hard, constantly moving around, constantly active, despite all the odds against them. They are working very hard and they're dynamic, creative. And it is that sense of a human, the woman, that she chose this theory. And then the concepts automatically got derived from that. And then the other variables like land ownership, size of land, source of land, land owning status, everything influenced the analytical category. That's what I'm now coming to. So once we clearly define our conceptual framework on the basis of the theoretical models, theoretical framework, which has three components I've already told, the analytical framework emerges. The analytical framework is the third cycle. The second one is largely about how I am collecting data, from whom I'm collecting data, what I regard as the data, what aspect of the data that I want to collect. She wanted to only collect social capital related data from them. She wanted to use observations, and she wanted to talk to the women. She wanted to just live with them. That will be the methodological choices that she made. But analytically, when you do that third cycle, the analytical cycle, the theory can still be ingrained, internally immanent in that. How do we do that? So what is analytical framework? Analytical framework is again logically connected to the conceptual and theoretical framework, and it's a derivative of that. But it is also a framework that kind of sketch the outline of the phenomenon and its connection. How am I going to analyze? For example, she clearly defined land rights, land sizes, ownership pattern, everything besides how she connects the variables called social capital. So the set of concepts like social capital, economic capital got connected to the variables like land size, land holding, status of land, size, everything. So that is the way I'm going to see the analytical connection is very, very important. How am I seeing the connections between these variables, and what is the specific kind of an analysis that I will be doing in this particular research? So it is a process that elaborates in our ideas in terms of the key connection between one and the other, and thereby the phenomenon that we are analyzing, the questions for which we are trying to find answers, emerge in such a way that it makes a lot of sense to us. So the analyzed phenomena needs to be done in a particular manner. The way we analyze needs to have a clearly evolved and sketched process. Very often I've seen research topics, very interestingly, a structural analysis or analytical study, or I could see a beautifully titled research which would carry something like a structural and functional analysis of relationship or sociological analysis. But I often see in the presentation of their data, the family data, the educational data will remain disconnected to the other data. For example, if someone is doing a research, say on a woman being a self-help group member, there is no connection between the educational status of her own family members and whether her empowerment or whether her membership has enhanced or not. So they are presented as if they are two neatly disconnected set of tables. I don't see an analytical relationship between this and that. So there is no correlation, there is no analytical relation, there is no interpretative analytical relations also. They are presented as if only data. So it actually makes one of our colleagues even to say that our research is nothing but a data collection, a glorified data collection. It is not exactly a research. Exactly what we are doing is nothing but a field worker's job. But we call ourselves researchers, even though what we essentially do is only a field worker's job. What does the field worker do without even knowing what the research is all about? If you really train him, he or she will go collect data, and that's what we do. So we need to put them all together and have an analytical relationship, see the analytical relationship. And this must be again defined well in advance. Then only the kind of data that we collect will be relevant. I often see in many research interview schedules, particularly, people spend nearly an hour collecting data about not only the respondents, but also the family members of the respondents, their educational status, their income status. And very often I find them underused or never used. They are never relevant to the data. So if you have a theoretical commitment, and if you have evolved your analytical framework well in advance, it will also inform the kind of data that you would like to collect. So this is not an instrumental or a strategic choice, but it's a choice that is very, very ethical and existential in nature. It is also a reflection of your personal worldview, personal commitment to the research. It's an expression of the self and research relationship that you have, because I called it as a social relationship. Here, I'm giving an interesting kind of a model that I myself personally used, an analytical framework here. I was doing a research on the poor people and the people in poverty. I don't even use the word poor people, because look at the conceptual difference here. Since I believe people are creative people, and poor people would really mean that they are eternally poor. But I would like to call them as people in poverty, rather than it's like, people having fever. We never call someone as fever person, a fever person or a fever people. We call someone as having fever. Similarly, we call people, now the different concepts, people with a disability. Similarly, people living in poverty, rather than poor people. So I was doing research on people living in poverty, and I wanted to see, despite being in poverty, they are still using their agency. It is not that all the poor people are 24/7 sad people. That even though despite having all the poverty, whether he is a beggar or a sex worker or a HIV patient or all the poorest persons, if you really see them, it is not that 24/7 their life is black and white and all the time they are sad. They also have their own sense of agency, creativity, imaginativeness, and they're also smiling. And they're also finding meaning to wake up for the next day. So I wanted to do a research. I believed in also being the creativity of not only myself, but also the persons that I see around. This is also my personal relationship with people. I treat everybody as creative people. My research also reflected that. I treated as people, the poorest people, the people in poverty as creative people. And I wanted to find out how they really express their creativity in different ways. And that research is about this. So I found that analytically, I could really find the relationship between three types of agencies. I called it as three types of agencies, three types of creativity that people express, and how these agencies reflecting themselves in terms of three different actions, and how they are related to three different institutional orientation. Modern institution, maybe their traditional institution, affirmative institution. When I say affirmative institution, I say all the people who are fighting for the rights, the social organizations, civil society organizations, NGOs, or the organizations that people themselves might have formed. Poor people, people in poverty might have formed their own organizations. So family as a traditional institution, state as a modern institution, people's organization as affirmative institution, how all these things are analytically connected. So once I was very clear, this is what I'm going to analyze. I'm going to collect data from people in terms of different agencies and different strategies, compare it with the orientations of the society, analyze it in relation to different social formations. And it was very clear. I didn't have to go and collect other kinds of data. I collected data that I needed. So these three are very important frameworks to start our research. And these three should be interwoven with our theoretical choices that we make. So the theoretical framework, conceptual framework, and analytical framework are all integrally connected and derivative of one another, and not necessarily linearly connected. In a qualitative sense, they can also influence. For example, at the end of the day, the theory that you have chosen to align yourself with can also get liberated from its own limitations, can also become a better theory because of the analytical results, analytical interpretations that you make. So it is not necessary that it is always linearly connected, that the theory remains holy and sacrosanct. No, it can also get challenged radically. So these are the very important components where one can weave the theories into that. And in specific terms, the remaining slides are basically about specific terms, how we can do that. How we can how our theoretical framework can in a very specific step-by-step sense can focus on some of these things. For example, the theoretical framework starts with a theoretical problem or the research problem, the purpose of research, the significance of the research, then the research question that we choose. So this is a very detailed one. I'll just quickly rush through for want of time. But I'm not really unhappy about it because I wanted to focus on those three components where how a research and theory can have a holy union in our research projects and thesis writing exercise that we do. Okay, just quickly, when you select a research framework, you need to focus on, as I have written very clearly, all these four dimensions. The research problem, when you evolve a research problem, it should be, again, driven by heart. Hunted questions should be the problem. You cannot find a problem because a corporate wants you to find a problem. You cannot really choose a problem because that's fashionable, that's going to get you jobs. Yes, they're all there. Definitely, sometimes we make those choices. But at least let us keep it in our conscience that we need to rub our choices against the very conscience that is filled with this information, research problem, haunted research problem. So, as I told, it is a very critical part of our research exercise, any dissertation research or any project also. It is a very critical component to have a clear-cut research problem, and that defines not only the problem, but that also helps us to choose the variables. And the theoretical model framework influences the research problem also. And this research problem should not only be looked from within our perspective, sometimes we may be ideological in nature, but also we have to look at it in terms of how others will look at the problem, whether it also makes the same sense. Is there any kind of a vibration, a kind of a congruence between what I think as a research problem, what society thinks as a research problem? So then comes the purpose. Again, I already elaborated on it, but what is the purpose here? Is my purpose liberatory, merely explanatory, or is it just to get certain instrumental results happening to me? So what is the purpose of my research? What is the purpose within internally? What is the purpose of the questions that I'm raising? And in a metaphysical, meta-theoretical sense, what is the purpose of my research itself? Is it really going to, whose lives are going to be changed? Is it just my life or the lives of the people whom I study? Or the institutions to which I'm affiliated? What changes at the end of it? Whose lives are becoming better? Whose knowledge is becoming more advanced because of that? And then the significance of the research. Who's going to, whether the policy changes will happen, whether in my own personal life I will move forward, whether in my own personal life I will be able to advance a particular knowledge. So this significance of the research, for whom it is significant, the community of researchers, my own peer researchers, the academic community, or the people in the field to whom it's going to become research. So the significance, again, that should also be influenced by the theoretical choice that we make. Okay, so this is, as I told, like there's an organic connection, a deep complementary relationship between research question and the theoretical framework. The questions must be asked in a way that reflects not only my deep theoretical commitment, but also the social relevance. And it also reflects questions that are resonating the ontological vision I have of people, the epistemological vision I have of my research. The questions cannot be simply instrumentalistic or simply abstract in nature. It should also reflect whether I'm really treating people in a democratic sense in the field and all that. So, because that's what exactly is going to connect you to the issue that you're going to solve. So the research question that we raise must be respectful, democratic, and filled with the social relationship spirit that I've talked about. So definitely it has to be useful. It has to be logical, but it doesn't mean that it is ritualistic, simply imitative, and primarily driven only by the research agenda of having to complete the research. So it should be not be based on convenience. It should be based again on the ontology and the epistemology and the methodological choice that I have made. Further elaborating on that, I'll just wind up in another 5 minutes so that we can have questions on that. I cannot overemphasize the notion of epistemology in our research. It is very important to really keep asking this question. And as I told already, our choice of theory is not governed by objective notion. I chose a theory because the world chooses it. There is no notion of objectivity here. And it is not even a question of subjectivity, but it's a question of reflexivity. The reason why Merton decided to do research on functionalism is absolutely, it is not subjective, definitely. But it is not objective also. It is not that some scientific reason was there for him to choose to be a functionalist. Perhaps he was a student of Parsons, deeply influenced by Parsons, and he gave him a worldview, an ontological position, his own sense of what is reality, social reality, and what people mean and meant to him. And that's what driven him, that's what drove him to choose functionalism as a theoretical model for him. So we all can choose our own theoretical model, not necessarily based on science, as I told, on basis of our heart, but it can be a very reflexive experience. It should not be subjective. Subjectivity can bring a lot of bias into that, but reflexivity can critically ask questions about our own biases. What is what reflexivity is about? Becoming aware of one's own biases and as much as possible trying to put them in the back burner, not necessarily wishing it away, it's not possible, but at least to try to make it evident to the readers and the audience so that they can always see why you are making a particular observation. They can immediately connect it to your own biases that you yourself openly stated. So that's where it is a reflexive kind of an exercise. And our research choices, the theoretical, conceptual, and methodological choices cannot be contradictory, questioning the very character of the research as well as the character of the researcher also. This is where I'm going to stop. I got a very long presentation, but the remaining part of it, I can just go on the basis of the questions that the audience will raise. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. This is Sambat Kumar.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you, sir. It was for really a wonderful presentation, sir. Few questions are there, sir.
Yes, sir.
Shall we, sir? Shall we start?
Sure, sir. Yes, sir.
Actually, the first question by Arul Prashad.
Yes, sir.
He asked, he said that very comprehensive presentation. And he said, not all social sciences ground their research on theories. So is it, he said that he asked whether his understanding is right.
Correct. It is very difficult to say that. In fact, we can talk about different levels of theories. It is very, I mean, it is an antithesis to research if a research is purely a mere data gathering exercise without being informed or without being grounded in a theory. Even though we keep talking about grounded theory, a grounded theory is not exactly what I mean here. Grounded theory is a theory that gets improved on the basis of data. But what I'm talking about, when you use the word grounded theory also, I'm grounding the theory, I understand that. But it is not a research if it is not based on any theory. But yes, there are different levels of theorization. And at one level or the other, the theories must influence your data collection exercise. You cannot do a data collection exercise like a field worker who does not have to know theory or does not have to have a broader understanding of the theoretical framework that influences the researcher. Yes, answering your question more specifically, it has to be influenced or grounded at least at some level, one level of theorization or the other level. We all know that there are different levels of theories. Micro level theory, meso level theory, and also macro level theories. And even though we are living in the era of micro level theories, it has to, some or the other levels of theorization must influence our research process. If you are really doing a research for a corporate or an NGO sector where your role is just mere, you are actually in the long assembly line of research making, you are only a small part in that. Yes, you can afford to do that. But if you are a researcher primarily, and if you are really holding on to the research, and if you play a vital role in the research process, then it's not possible to think of a research without it being grounded at one level or the other level.
Okay. So next question, sir.
Yes.
It is actually posted by Sakti Prakash.
Yes.
And he asked, actually, is it mandatory to apply theory in sociological research?
Absolutely. In fact, that's a habit of heart that we all suffer from. We all think For some reason or the other, we have always thought theory is a kind of an appendage, something that is an extra burden or a luggage that we can leave and move on in our research journeys. But no, the very presentation and the very evangelical spirit with which I've been going about telling people is that, yes, it is very important to have a theory. We cannot afford to call ourselves sociological researcher without really having a sound knowledge of theories and the theories that we will be using. It is not that you have to have a bias for a particular theory. Yes, your ontology and epistemology may reflect a particular theory, but you may also have a critical association with it. You are always waiting to what Karl Popper would call it as waiting to falsify your own choice of theories. But that spirit is very, very important. That's why it's called critical reflexive association with theory. But it is very important to have a theory. Otherwise, one would not be able to call himself or herself, whatever may be the kind of, even a research article that you publish cannot be, as I told, how our publication industry has spoiled our commitment to research. So we have to really work against this habit of thought, habit of our heart, academic heart, that says it is possible to do a research without theory.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah, sir. Next question, sir. This is by Dar Mansoor. He asked how we go about research on a particular topic when there is no theory or theory is in developing phase. That's what his question, sir. Actually, he gave an example also.
Yeah.
Is that he is working on transgenders in Kashmir.
Yeah.
Okay. There is hardly any well-established theory on this.
Yeah.
So he asked how to go about it.
Yeah. Yeah, if you really, in a very philosophical sense, if you understand theories are in a epistemological sense, they are derivative of the world that we engaged with. In other words, the world was not born with a theory. We all had born with experiences, and we saw incidences in front of us, and we developed theories for it. So theories are always, as you rightly said, like there may be a reality which may not have a clearly organized theory to explain it or interpret it. But if you philosophically look at a theory is nothing but a kind of a proven opinion of us. It's proven beyond doubt, or proven to such a convincing way that it's now being parading itself as a theory. But it is very important to start with the particular perspective towards that reality. Whether it's a transgender, whatever may be the community of people that whom you're studying, it is not possible to imagine that there can be a situation where there is no theory. Yes, the theories can be derivative of the theories that you already know. As I told, it is a relationship. It is actually a kind of relationship that we have with the research community or the subject of research. And in this context, our research cannot be happening in a vacuum. When you are watching a cricket match or a football match, you cannot watch a football match without taking sides. You have to be a lover of football to watch it, or if you really want to enjoy the football match, you have to be on one side or the other. Then the match wouldn't make much sense to us. Similarly, when we are studying social reality, we already know what exactly makes more sense to us, and that's what is going to become. That's what I mean by the ontological and epistemological dimension of a theory. So it is not that one has to really wait for a ready-made theory to be thrown from above, but sometimes if you understand it in a philosophical spirit, theory is defining my relations with the community of people whom I am studying. Theory is defining my epistemological standpoint with the subject that I am inquiring into. Then yes, theories will emerge. Theories can exist there also.
Yes, sir. Sir, next question, sir. This is from Saumya.
Yes.
I think a scholar from Bharati University. She asked, do we have any effect on research design or methods when theory act as primary driving force in research?
Yeah, quite often when we choose our research tools for data collection or even our research design, if you want reflexively ask the question, why I'm choosing that research design, or why I'm choosing a particular research instrument, maybe an interview schedule or a questionnaire. We all have certain formulaic understanding, but there is always, we need to have, and sometimes if you really reflect upon your own actions, besides the convenience factor, besides the repetitive factor, besides the ritualistic factor, you may just not have any reason why you are choosing it, because it's so convenient, because everybody else does it, or because that's what every researcher thinks it's scientific to do. You cannot do life history because you have to show some interview. So we've been doing it in a very formulaic sense all along. But if you really, as I told, if you start having that pre-theoretical commitment, and if you think that as a sociologist, your position is very clear. You are not a newsreader sociologist who can just simply mouth all that is there in the textbook. When I read sociology textbooks over a period of time, I also decide which kind of a sociologist I shape myself to be. Am I a sociologist who thinks structure is very important? I'm a sociologist who thinks individuals' creativity, what constitutes society. I think as a sociologist, we need to make a choice between whether our individual creativity makes structure or structure makes individual. Or even if it's going to make a middle range theory, something is going to always predominate. And that is where that theoretical alignment also happens. So I'm not able to imagine a sociology student or a social science student who cannot have a fundamental notion of what is my idea of social actors and what is my idea of society. Is society objective or subjective? And the moment you make that choice, you are actually making a theoretical choice. So naturally, your research designs, your methodological methods of data collection, they all will be influenced by it.
Okay, so wonderful, sir. So next question, sir. This is by Akila Johnson. Again, she is also from Bhargava University. As a scholar. Her question is, what would be the challenges in using multiple theories in a research?
Yeah. Whenever I say theoretical framework, I very carefully chose not theory, but a theoretical framework. A theoretical framework need not necessarily be a marriage to a singular. It's not a monogamy. A monogamous marriage to one theory. Theoretical framework can be influenced and informed by different theories also, as long as they do not contradict, as long as they are fundamentally expressive of ignorance of us, fundamentally expressive of our own confusions. That's where I remember many of them would just come and ask me, sir, can you give me a book on functionalism, Marxism? I'm using Marxist theory for this paragraph, this chapter, and I'm this particular analysis section, and I'm using functionalist theory there, sir. I'm using this theory. I used to ask them, how can just these theories coexist with one another? They are fundamentally contradicting. They are even questioning the very foundational understanding that you have of the people whom you are studying. So it is quite possible to have consistent and mutually enhancing and mutually elaborating, mutually further breaking down theories coming from different authors, different theoretical foundations can coexist within a theoretical framework. So many theories could be there. For example, if one is doing a phenomenological research, they can also include a bit of ethnography. They can also bring a bit of Marxist, the old young Marxist understanding of philosophy of money into it. So we need to really find the choices that I make of the theory, the multiple theories, as I again repeatedly reiterate, cannot be an expression of your confusions and ignorance, but should be an expression of the ethical, epistemological and ontological clarity that you have. And when, as long as they're informed by these epistemological, methodological and ontological clarity, and these theories can coexist even though there are many theories in that, because they are undergirded by a consistency and a clarity, even though there are many theories. In my own research, I used many theories, but they are mutually empowering, mutually enhancing one another, and they are deeply expressive of my methodological, epistemological, and ontological clarity.
Yes, sir. Yes, nice. So next question by Indra Priyadarshini. It's also from Bhargava University. She asked, when we define the research relationship before getting into the field, doesn't it mean we approach our respondents with predefined idea, which may hinder the objective nature of the research?
Yes, very good question.
Yes.
I say repeatedly, I was trying to make that observation. We are, as sociologists or social scientists, Our unit of analysis is a very specific unit of analysis consisting of specific actors, which means our unit of analysis is society, and our the social actors are our primary people in it. So we are doing a research either by direct encounter with people or abstractions that are available in forms, in texts, in movies and novels, whatever it may be. So we are primarily, our business as sociologists, which is a bad word, is to do research on society and the people in it. And it will be a travesty of justice to bring a completely alien notions of objectivity and scientific and positivism, which were reserved for non-reflective, non-alive material data like physics and chemistry, the physical and chemical units. We cannot really import them to study social science institutions or social science realities or social realities. So we need to really grow out of that positivistic understanding of objectivity. I am definitely not in favor of subjectivity. I'm talking about critical distancing. I'm talking about being more disciplined than being objective. When I say let us abandon objectivity, I'm not talking about indiscipline or irresponsibility and coolness. I'm talking about more discipline, more critical reflection, distancing. In fact, it calls for more discipline. But it is not a sense of justice to bring that objective notion into that. So when I say I'm defining my relationship with my theory, my commitment to the theory, which consists of all the other three, which also includes my relations with the people, I'm not talking about a very subjectively convenience-driven relationship, but a deeply reflexive relationship. And there's no harm in reflecting that relationship, influencing our data collection process. In fact, that is what theory is all about. The reason why in social sciences we have many theories, unlike science, in science you have only one paradigm, and all the theories are derivative of that paradigm. You cannot have too many paradigms within science, but in social sciences, I'm already talking about two paradigms. One which treats individual as the basic unit, the other treats society as the basic unit of analysis, structure as the basic unit of analysis, and there are many other paradigms within that. The reason why we have too many paradigms is because of the beautiful ambiguity of social sciences. Yes, so there is no harm in going with one paradigm or one paradigmatic factor with which we approach the data. It is not bias, it is an expression of the paradigm that you have chosen. And a scientist always approaches his own material data with his own paradigm. Yes, today they have only singular paradigm and looks like objective. But tomorrow that paradigm is going to be thrown, which was what Thomas Kuhn kind of people say in their book, you know. But yes, it is going to be thrown, and they will also have to adapt a new paradigm. We are already having many paradigms, and no harm in adapting a paradigmatic relationship. So let us not call it in a very self-depreciating manner as a very subjectively driven relationship. It's a paradigmatic relationship.
Yeah. So next question, sir. This is actually a question from Anis Rahman.
Yes,
a scholar asked, you mentioned that without theories, your thesis will become unsound. How it is possible, sir?
Yeah, in fact, if it is possible in the sense, yes, it is possible. We are able to do a research and we are getting our doctorates awarded also. All these things are happening because of the particular ecosystem that we are part of. I've already told about an ecosystem that we have in terms of our institutional practices, the practices outside the institution in terms of academic publishing industry, and also our own graduate programs, particularly in social sciences. We have a kind of an ecosystem that has never told us adequately the importance and the necessity of a theory. So we've almost come to believe that it is possible to do a research without a theory. The fact that it is now possible to do a research and then get your degree does not speak of a good research, but speak of a particular kind of an ecosystem that we all have developed over a period of time in certain kind of contexts. For example, in certain institutions in India today, you cannot get your doctorate degree without a theoretical orientation in your research. I'm talking about some universities like JNU. If I don't have a theory, my teacher would, guide would always want to have a discussion on theory first. He wants to know what is my orientation, and he would never approve a dissertation which is only adding a theory as an afterthought. Perhaps we have now come to, but I'm not saying all the teachers in all the institutions. Everywhere there are people who are breaking new grounds. Within JNU, kind of institution also, there are people who do not regard theories. But yes, that's the ecosystem that I'm talking about. But if you really happen to go to a good university and a good kind of a publication, publishing houses like Contribution to Indian Sociology, even an article, you have to have a particular nuanced theoretical orientation should be there. It cannot just mere kind of what Merton would call. In fact, Merton himself has discounted that possibility. He talked about middle range theories rather than a theory that only involves in data collection. He was dismissive of that. So some publications may publish an article which is just that data collection kind of exercise. No, but yeah, I think we need to get out of the ecosystem, and we need to all have to become part of an ecosystem that tells that research. And as I'm talking about, even an MA student need to have an understanding of what is his orientation to society.
Yes, sir. Another question by ED actually. The person asked is, you mentioned bastardization of research.
Yes, sir.
Does this mean that a researcher should stick to the theoretical framework or theory till the end of the research? Are we allowed to review our position during the research? Can you elaborate?
Yes, sir. When I say theoretical choice or theoretical framework, I made it very clear. I hope if I made it, if I'm not made it clear, let me make it again clear. The choices are not instrumentalistic. The choice of theory that I choose is not instrumentalistic, but deeply reflective of my own personal worldview, the researcher's personal worldview. And I told this reflexively derived, reflexively organized, critically distanced worldview is not subjectivity. So when you are deeply driven by that existential, ontological, epistemological, whatever I repeated, then you will not be able to choose your theory instrumentally. You would definitely change your theory during the course of your research because you are constantly associating with your theory critically, and you would always be willing to falsify it, then confirm it. In a very Karl Popper says, a good research is not which wants to confirm what the fellow has already told. That is a neurotic research. He calls that only a neurotic, psychologically neurotic fellow will want to say what he thinks is right all the time. A creative person will always want to look for falsifying what he is holding onto it, because the world is a better place. Because we always want to move forward rather than hold on to our old ideas. So definitely, your theoretical choice, the new theories that you're going to integrate, the changes that you're going to effect in your theories as you move along in your research process. Sometimes it can happen 6 years because many of our research process happens around that time. Yes, you will definitely change. Again, out of the same reflexive commitment. Yes, you are very open-minded. You have clearly organized your research relationship very clearly on the basis of reflex relationship. In that situation, it can happen. But if you change it instrumentally, because it's convenient, because it's very easy to do, or because it satisfies someone, that is what I mean when I say that's what I call bastardization. If you just change it for convenience, instrumental, externally driven nature.
Sir, last two questions, sir, actually. Yes, sir. Yeah. This question is from Vijayalakshmi Krishna Mohan.
Yes.
She asked, how do we contextualize first world theories for our Indian context?
Very interesting question. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Definitely. As I told in another session in some other university, I was telling that we should not be calling ourselves a sociologist. Strictly speaking, we should not be calling ourselves a sociologist with capital S. We should be calling ourselves as Euro-American sociologist. I'm a student of Euro-American sociology rather than MA sociology, because primarily most of our theories are given for good or bad reasons, perhaps because sociology was born in Euro-American context, or it was born in Europe and further shaped in America. Most of our theories are first world theories. And yes, we need to be very critically associating with these theories. We need to be aware of their biases, their colonizing instincts, their colonizing impulses. We need to really be aware and take cognizance of. Definitely, we need to be very critically aware of it. But if you really look at theories as things that can enlighten the dark zones of my own epistemological experiences. I'm in India. Yes, I'm a third world person. And I'm not committed to my third world theories in a phonetic manner, as I am opposed to first world theory as a phonetic. So I'm actually on the lookout for a theory that can illuminate the dark experiences of myself and my fellow citizens of the community or nation, whatever it may be. I just want, as a sociologist, I'm committed to illuminating the dark experiences of my own hearts and that of my own fellow citizens. So any theory that illuminates the dark zones are welcome. But I'm not going to blindly adopt them. I'm going to adopt them because I'm very critically associating with my own association is very critical with myself. So my association with theories will not be concessional in nature. When I'm self-critical, I will not be critical. I will not stop being critical of the Western theories. So the first world theories, we can take them, but we need to be very critically taking them. But as long as they're really passing the critical tests, they are welcome to be used.
Yes, sir. So last question, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Sir, can we use the concept slash theory in a sociological research when the concept is don't developed by the sociologist? Example, intersectionality of culture. Or is it necessary that our conceptual or theoretical framework should have a sociological background?
Very wonderful question. Very relevant question also. Thank you.
This question is by Sahid, sir. Sahid.
Oh, great
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Yes, very interesting. And it also gives me an opportunity to just take 1 minute and I'll answer it. Yes, there is no obsession. In fact, if there is one discipline within the social science category, which is so open, which is constantly breaking the walls of its own houses, it's been sociology. It has always been welcoming other thought processes, other theoretical models from the neighboring disciplines like psychology, human sciences, political sciences, in fact, anthropology, whatever it may be, political, all the other disciplines have been welcome to influence sociology. So sociologists should not be obsessive of guarding the walls and the gates of sociology. We need to be open, and there is no harm in that. In fact, the economists have influenced a lot in the recent past. Even the instance model I showed of social capital approach, that social capital concept did not come from sociologists. It came from economists like Putnam, political scientists like Rawls. See, it all came from different disciplines. For that matter, even the capability approach that Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum developed, which we use extensively within sociology, again came from economists. So there is no hard and fast rule that sociologists should be married only to sociology. They can be plural, promiscuous, as it were, in nature. We should be welcoming. In fact, that's the beautiful thing about sociology. And no other discipline has been also encouraging civil war within sociology like sociology. No other discipline has encouraged such internal critique within within social sciences like sociology. Absolutely. No harm in that. In fact, sociology nowadays is more open, but boundaries are blurring.
Yes. Yes, sir. Sir, thank you so much, sir. It was really thought-provoking, sir, throughout the presentation. We really enjoyed your presentation, and I think it was a great learning for all of us, sir. Yeah. Yes. Now I'll request Suresh Babu sir to propose vote of thanks.
It's my pleasure.
Good afternoon, everyone present here. It's my prime duty to propose vote of thanks. The entire lecture, that the theory is important because it gives you the base on what to look for and how and why, where and which. Without theory and background, you are like going nowhere, total lost. Theory is the knowledge that is deployed or developed, and through the research, you are developing a new knowledge to enrich the established theory more. Applying theory in not only in sociology, but all social sciences is equal, because most of the social sciences, it may be economics, political science, or public administration, history, and whatever the subject we are learning with, the approaching or applying a theory is must to do any kind of research. This research, this lecture is being delivered by our eminent scholar, Dr. Kumaranji, very systematically with a short and sweet and excellent presentation. and it's a very thought-provoking presentation for all the social science researchers. Sir, Dr. Kumaranji, on behalf of Department of Sociology and Population Studies, Bharathiar University, Coimbatore, we wholeheartedly thank you and appreciate you for excellent deliverance of this excellent lecture, sir. And seriously, we'll definitely call you to our department in offline, and you will be a regular visitor to the department, we'll promise you. And definitely we'll give you our email ID to my participants or those who are participating in and around. And they will ask you some questions, any questions or clarification, they will get it from you, sir. So once again, thank you very much, sir, and appreciate you. I thank Dr. Sambat Kumar, person head, for organizing this event, and also I thank Prabhu for technical support. I thank my guest faculties who are morally boosting us. I thank all the participants and colleagues and various parts of India. I thank my university authorities for giving us an opportunity to organize program. Thank you once again. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, thank you so much.